Ever wondered what ignited the frosty relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, marking the beginning of the Cold War? As World War II drew to a close, two superpowers emerged from the rubble, each wielding immense influence and power. The United States and the Soviet Union, though allies in the war, found themselves at odds in the post-war world. The ideological differences between the two nations were stark. The United States, a beacon of capitalism and democracy, stood in sharp contrast to the Soviet Union, a titan of communism and state control. These polar opposite ideologies, coupled with mutual distrust and political maneuvering, sparked a cold, silent war. This wasn't a war of bullets and bombs, but a war of ideologies, a war of espionage, of propaganda, of influence. The world became their chessboard, nations their pawns, as each side sought to assert its dominance and propagate its way of life. Thus the stage was set for a war unlike any other, a war not fought on battlefields but in the minds and hearts of people around the world. Opening. As the world watched, the Cold War escalated, reaching every corner of the globe. In the aftermath of the Second World War, two superpowers emerged, each with their unique ideologies and ambitions. The United States, a beacon of democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union, a stronghold of communism. Their conflicting visions for the world order led to a standoff that would last for over 4 decades. One of the critical events that marked the progression of the Cold War was the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949. The United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations banded together, pledging mutual defense against any external threat. This was primarily a deterrent against the Soviet Union's growing influence in Eastern Europe. In response, the Soviets established their equivalent, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955, creating a clear divide between the East and the West. The world was now effectively divided into two camps, each armed to the teeth and ready to defend its worldview. In the midst of this growing tension, a new frontier emerged: space. The space race, as it came to be known, was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a symbol of national pride, technological prowess, and military might. The Soviets took an early lead with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, but the United States fought back and ultimately triumphed by landing a man on the moon in 1969. However, the Cold War was not just about military alliances and space exploration. It was also a period of intense political crises. The most notable among these was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores, sparked a 13-day standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. It was a chilling testament to how quickly the Cold War could turn hot. Throughout these years, proxy wars raged in various parts of the world, from Korea and Vietnam to Afghanistan, as each superpower sought to extend its sphere of influence. These wars were often brutal and bloody, causing immense human suffering and further deepening the divide between the East and the West. Beyond the headlines and the front lines, the Cold War also penetrated daily life. From the Red Scare in America to the Iron Curtain in Europe, fear and suspicion permeated society. Propaganda became a powerful tool, shaping public opinion and fueling the flames of this ideological battle. Closing. Each event brought the world closer to the brink of nuclear war, a chilling reminder of the power and fear that defined this era. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted period in history, characterized by a tense and precarious balance of power. It was a time of unprecedented political, military, and social change that reshaped the world as we know it today. But how did this icy standoff thaw, leading to the end of the Cold War? The final chapter of the Cold War is a tale of change, compromise, and ultimately, collapse. The 1980s began with an escalation of tensions, but as the decade progressed, the ice between the United States and the Soviet Union began to melt. One of the key contributors to this thaw was the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. Taking office in 1985, Gorbachev ushered in a new era of glasnost and perestroika, or openness and restructuring. He sought to rebuild the Soviet economy and society, and knew that to do so he had to reduce the burdensome military expenses that were draining the country. On the other side of the world, a charismatic leader named Ronald Reagan was in power in the United States. Reagan too was eager for change. He believed in a world where freedom reigned, and he saw an opportunity in Gorbachev. Together, they began to dismantle the barriers that had kept their nations at odds for decades. The year 1987 saw a pivotal moment in this process. On a crisp December day, Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and famously challenged Gorbachev, saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." This wasn't just a call to demolish a physical barrier, but a symbolic one, representing the divide between East and West, communism and capitalism. Just 2 years later, in 1989, the unimaginable happened. The Berlin Wall, that concrete and barbed wire symbol of division, was breached. People from East and West Berlin began chipping away at the wall, and within hours, the city was united for the first time in nearly 3 decades. This was a momentous event, a clear sign that the Cold War was nearing its end. Yet, the definitive end of the Cold War came not from the United States, but from within the Soviet Union itself. The country was crumbling under economic strain, political unrest, and a rising tide of nationalism. Gorbachev's reforms, while well-intentioned, had inadvertently opened a Pandora's box of problems that the Soviet Union was ill-equipped to handle. On Christmas Day in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin, and in its place, the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation was raised. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved, and with it, the Cold War came to an end. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, as the Soviet Union dissolved, marking a new era in global politics. This was not a victory for one side over the other, but a shift towards a new world order, one that continues to shape our world today. The end of the Cold War was a moment of hope, a promise of a future where diplomatic dialogue could triumph over divisive dogma. So what can we learn from this frosty period in our history? The Cold War, a standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, reshaped the world stage post-World War II. A silent battle, it was marked not by direct warfare, but by political maneuvering, espionage, and the looming threat of nuclear war. The inception of the Cold War was rooted in ideological differences and fear, leading to a tense, 4-decade-long ballet of power. The progression of this war was marked by significant events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, and the Vietnam War, all of which heightened global tension. Ultimately, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, as the Soviet Union collapsed from within, marking the end of this chilling era. But why does this matter today? Because it shaped our present geopolitical landscape. The Cold War may be over, but its effects still echo in our world today, a reminder of a time when the world was divided and the threat of nuclear war was all too real.